It always started with the scent, not the call to prayer echoing from the minarets, or the faint clatter of donkey hooves over worn cobblestone, though those came too. But the scent hit you first. Cinnamon, roasted chickpeas, warm bread fresh out of the tandoor oven. Somewhere close, incense burned steadily. Not overbearing, just enough to tease curiosity. And if you kept walking, following your nose, the market opened up like an unexpected memory. Baghdad, in the prime of the Abbasid Caliphate, wasn't merely a city, it was an idea, a pulse, something alive. They called it the jewel of the world, and on some days you could believe the city knew it. Traders came from far corners, Samarkand, Cairo, Damascus, even China, and they brought with them silks, spices, stories, and debts. But what they walked into wasn't just another souk. This was Baghdad. The city had been built with intention. Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph, had imagined a perfectly round capital, walls like a disc, gates facing the four directions of the compass, and the Tigris River flowing like a lifeline nearby. He didn't just want a city of power, he wanted one of wonder, and it worked. At its peak, Baghdad was home to maybe 1 million people. That's not a typo. 1 million. And the market? Well, it was its beating heart. You see, the marketplace wasn't just a place to shop. It was where news travelled faster than pigeons, where poems were exchanged like coin, and where reputations were made or destroyed. The streets wove like threads through a tapestry of stone and shade. Covered walkways shielded you from the blazing sun, but the light still danced through wooden slats above. The ground, uneven in parts, dusty in others, but always alive with movement. Now, the way the market was set up wasn't some haphazard maze. It was structured, almost surgical. Different trades had their own quarters. There was the book market. Yes, a whole section dedicated to manuscripts. Then came the spice vendors, usually grouped together, their stalls a riot of colour and fragrance. Further down, you'd find the jewellers. Their stalls gleamed like treasure chests cracked open, with glass cases or polished wooden boxes showing off rings, bangles, and golden pendants, some so delicate they looked like spider webs spun in sunlight. And oh, the noise. Not loud in the way we think of traffic or sirens, but layered, human. The rhythmic calls of sellers hawking their figs and almonds, the soft murmur of buyers bargaining or arguing, depending on the mood. The laughter of children, and somewhere, always, the strum of a rabab or a street poet, reciting verses that made people pause mid-transaction. You'd think chaos, but it wasn't. It was choreography. Stalls were small, modest wooden frames, many draped with cloth or reed mats. Shopkeepers sat cross-legged on raised platforms behind low counters. Not all of them, of course. Some stood, some leaned, some chewed dates while keeping one eye on the crowd. But the setup was unmistakably theirs. Each stall had personality, some painted with vibrant blues or greens, others left raw and weathered by the sun. Some were open air, others tucked into the stone walls of narrow alleys, recessed like quiet secrets. But not everything was static. Carts moved constantly. Donkeys ambled by, their backs heavy with goods. Men pushed wooden barrows filled with cucumbers or linens. There were water sellers carrying goatskin sacks, crying out for thirsty mouths in the midday heat. And yes, even beggars, some blind, some with tales of loss that may or may not have been true. But in Baghdad's market, everyone had a place, a rhythm. Clothing vendors displayed their robes like paintings, long flowing thobs of fine cotton, some plain, others embroidered with golden threads. Rich merchants and scholars browsed quietly, often with servants trailing behind. Women came too, their presence often underestimated by outsiders. Some fully veiled, others not. Some bought fabrics or perfumes. Others were sellers themselves, especially in the produce corners, where older women sat behind baskets of mint, coriander, or lemons that looked like little suns. Now, let's pause for a moment. Picture the smell of cumin warming in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of dried apricots. Imagine brushing past a man selling ink pots and quills, only to be stopped by the sudden clang of a blacksmith's hammer striking copper just around the bend. And there, do you hear it? That faint melody drifting from the oud player near the bread stall. Markets weren't only for things, they were for people, for moments, for memories. And yes, there was order, despite appearances. The muhtasib, the market inspector, kept a watchful eye. He wasn't just looking for spoiled meat or rigged scales. He watched manners, honesty, decorum. His job was to keep greed in check and ensure fairness reigned. If a vendor cheated a buyer, public shame, sometimes a fine. If someone fought, removed. If prices inflated beyond reason, the inspector stepped in. Money changed hands in the form of dinars, gleaming gold coins, or silver dirhams, or even copper foals. And not everyone paid up front. Credit existed. So did debt. Merchants often kept handwritten ledgers, inked carefully in Arabic script, sometimes marked with seals or signed witnesses. If that sounds bureaucratic, it was. But it worked. Trade flowed, goods moved, people trusted. And while the days were vibrant, the nights had their own magic. Lanterns hung from ropes stretched across the alleys. Flickering candlelight painted golden halos on the stone. Food vendors stayed open late, especially during Ramadan or festival seasons. Storytellers gathered crowds under archways, spinning tales of jinn, prophets, and heroes long gone. Children ran, lovers lingered, and old men smoked long pipes, their eyes distant. In these moments, Baghdad felt eternal, untouchable, as if time forgot to pass here. But of course, that's not how time works. Still, while it lasted, the markets of Abbasid Baghdad were more than places to buy things. They were living theatres of sound, smell, sight, and soul. They were where strangers became friends, where a bag of almonds might cost a smile and a story, and where the city's heartbeat could be felt in every coin tossed, every robe folded, every poem recited. And somehow, walking through it all, you didn't feel like a customer. You felt like you belonged. If you turned down the winding lane just past the copper market, where the smell of heated metal lingered like a stubborn guest, you'd find yourself in a corridor of color so rich, it felt like walking through a dream. This was the spice section, and calling it just spices doesn't even come close. Saffron was the crown jewel, delicate threads tucked into tiny glass jars, their golden red hue almost glowing under the afternoon sun. Sellers kept them behind cloth or under careful watch. Saffron wasn't cheap, and everybody knew its worth. Right next to it, cinnamon sticks bundled in twine, sweet and woody. Mounds of ground turmeric like sunlit sand. Star anise, nutmeg, dried rose petals, each piled in carefully shaped cones that defied wind and touch, as if gravity obeyed the laws of trade here. It wasn't just about what things looked like. It was the aromas, deep, ancient, almost dizzying. You didn't browse spices with your hands. You did it with your nose. A few steps ahead, the air changed again. You were now in the perfume alley. Yes, a whole section for oils and scents. Musk, ambergris, frankincense, myrrh. Some came from the Far East, others from Africa. And the bottles, oh, they were art. Tiny glass vessels shaped like birds, flasks painted with silver vines, some sealed with wax, others with silk caps. Buyers would stop, uncap one, dab a finger behind an ear or on the inside of a wrist, and close their eyes. The right scent wasn't just a preference, it was a signature. But not everyone was after luxury. Some sought the basics: lentils, wheat, chickpeas, dried dates. These were the staples, sold in bulk, poured into sacks or clay pots. Sellers scooped them with hollowed-out gourd shells or iron ladles. Prices were marked in chalk on wooden boards, though everyone bargained anyway. Bargaining wasn't rude, it was expected, part of the dance. Then came the textiles. And listen, if you thought today's fashion scene had flair, you haven't stood in a Baghdadi cloth alley in full bloom. Silks from China shimmered in every shade you could imagine: peacock blue, emerald green, crimson, gold. Indian cottons arrived with delicate embroidery, and Persian wool dyed in earthy tones was prized for winter robes. Tailors set up right inside the market. Some had apprentices running errands. Others worked slowly, methodically, measuring cloth with long wooden rulers, chalking outlines, slicing fabric with knives honed to a whisper. They didn't just sew, they sculpted. You'd hear the snip of shears beside the hum of gossip. Who got married, who gained favor at court, who wrote a new poem that people couldn't stop quoting. The market heard it all. And yes, books were sold here too, not hidden away in some dark library, but right out in the open. The book souk was a wonder. Scribes copying texts with reed pens, ink-stained hands gliding across parchment like calligraphic dancers. There were stacks of bound pages wrapped in leather or simply rolled into scrolls. Topics, everything: poetry, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, hadith, Greek classics in translation. Buyers didn't just purchase books, they gathered to debate them. The marketplace wasn't just a hub for goods. It was a living university. You might spot a well-dressed scholar leaning over a volume of Galen's medical writings, while a curious youth tried to catch a glimpse, or two men arguing in hushed tones over whether a newly translated passage from Aristotle had been interpreted properly. Yes, the market sold fish and figs, but it also sold knowledge, tangible and precious. Meanwhile, in the food corners, life took on another rhythm. Vendors lined up shoulder to shoulder, fires crackling in clay stoves, skewers of lamb sizzling over charcoal. Bread was everywhere: flatbreads, round loaves, stuffed pockets filled with onions and parsley. Sellers used long wooden paddles to slide dough into underground ovens, then pulled them out golden and blistered. People didn't always sit to eat. They walked and nibbled, a roll of bread in one hand, a cup of tamarind drink in the other. Some vendors sold thick lentil soup in earthen bowls. Others specialized in pickled vegetables: radish, carrots, olives, served with sprigs of mint and slices of lemon. There were date syrup sellers, offering tiny spoons to taste. One man might sell nothing but boiled chickpeas sprinkled with cumin and salt, but his line would stretch around the corner. You could eat like a king for a few dirhams, or splurge on stuffed pigeon with rice and almonds if you really wanted to impress a companion. And if you looked closer, you'd see something else. Women working. Not just buying, though they did that with practiced expertise, but selling. Elderly women, especially, often ran stalls filled with herbs and medicinal plants. Mint, sage, fenugreek, licorice root. They'd offer remedies for everything from coughs to heartbreak, quoting old sayings as if they held medical degrees. And maybe, in a way, they did. You know what was remarkable? It all worked. Despite the messiness, the shouting, the bargaining, the chaos, there was rhythm, a shared language of trade. Sellers trusted certain suppliers. Buyers knew who gave honest weight. You could leave something with a vendor and come back later. Not always, but often enough to believe in a basic code of honor. And if that code broke, well, there was the muhtasib. He didn't wear armor or carry a sword, but make no mistake, his presence was felt. If meat spoiled in the sun, if weights were tampered with, if a seller was caught inflating prices unjustly, the muhtasib stepped in. He enforced ethics, not through force usually, but through reputation. Public shaming was a weapon, sometimes fines, occasionally a brief imprisonment. But it wasn't just about cheating. He watched for loud disputes, inappropriate behavior, immoral dress. Markets were economic zones, yes, but also moral ones. You had to behave, or at least pretend to. At the end of a long day, when the shadows stretched thin and the sun dipped behind the city's domes, the market began to shift again. Vendors packed up. Some rolled cloth across their wares, tying it with ropes and locking things away in hidden drawers. Food sellers cleaned grills and swept the earth. Smoke lifted, laughter lingered. But some corners stayed lit, especially during festivals or nights in Ramadan when the souk came alive under lantern light. Strings of oil lamps dangled overhead, casting warm, flickering halos across the cobblestones. Musicians set up beside fountains. Children spun tops. Lovers passed shy glances near spice stalls. And poets, oh, the poets, they'd gather near steps or low walls, reciting verses that caught in the throat. Not everyone stopped to listen, but many did. Because in Baghdad, even the market had music. At first glance, it all seemed spontaneous, organic. People coming and going, shouting prices, haggling like it was a competitive sport. But under the chatter and the dust, the Abbasid markets ran on a silent structure. Not exactly formal, not quite rigid, but firm enough that things didn't fall apart. And money, well, money was the quiet master of the dance. Gold dinars, silver dirhams, copper falls. Those were the stars of the show. But it wasn't just about coin. Some of the wealthiest merchants, especially those who dealt in bulk goods like textiles, spices, or books, worked on credit. Written promises, sealed agreements, trust, scribbled down on parchment, rolled and signed with wax or string. They didn't carry sacks of dinars in their sleeves. They carried ledgers. Trade notes, sometimes called sack, were issued, honored, exchanged. Think of it as an early version of a check, though nobody back then would have used that word. You could write a sack in Damascus, and someone in Baghdad would cash it, because networks of merchants, many family-run for generations, honored each other. Reputation meant everything. A name was as good as gold. Lose your name? You'd lose your business before sundown. But let's zoom in, back to the actual coins. The dinar was gold, small, heavy, and reassuring in the palm, minted carefully with Arabic inscriptions, often quoting Quranic verses or the caliph's name. The dirham was silver, slightly larger and more common. Fols, on the other hand, was copper, used for everyday things, like a few pieces of fruit or a bowl of lentils. It jingled, a bit cheaper sounding, but no less important. Prices weren't fixed, not in most parts of the market. One day, a small sack of almonds might go for 4 dirhams. The next, maybe 5. It depended on supply, the mood of the seller, the time of day, even the weather. Rain meant less foot traffic. Less foot traffic meant desperate vendors. Desperate vendors meant better deals. But buyers knew this game. You never paid the first price. Never. It wasn't considered polite. Bargaining wasn't a nuisance. It was etiquette. You'd offer half. The seller would laugh like you'd just told a bad joke. He'd wave his hand, call you generous, sarcastically, and suggest something barely lower. You'd pretend to walk away. He'd sigh. You'd both meet somewhere in the middle, and everyone left satisfied. Sort of. But behind these small dances was something massive. The empire-wide trade routes. Baghdad wasn't just a capital. It was a crossroads. The Silk Road brushed past it, bringing Chinese porcelain, jade, and most prized of all, silk. From India came spices, cotton, sugar, even monkeys and parrots for the rich. Persia offered carpets, gems, and master artisans. From the west, Egypt, the Levant, even far-off Andalusia, came glassware, papyrus, and olive oil. And in return, Baghdad exported, not just goods, but ideas, books, translated from Greek, Syriac, and Sanskrit into Arabic, medical knowledge, astronomy, literature, culture itself moved along the veins of trade. And merchants were more than peddlers. They were couriers of civilization. Caravans brought bulk. Camels loaded with textiles or grain entered the city gates at dawn, bells jangling, dust thick on their backs. They headed first to the Khan, a kind of caravanserai, part rest stop, part warehouse. Goods were unloaded, catalogued, and then passed on to brokers. Brokers knew who needed what. A cloth seller needed Indian indigo. A spice vendor was low on cardamom. The broker found it, took his cut, and the market kept humming. But there were also solo travelers, Jewish traders from Yemen, Christian cloth dealers from Armenia, Zoroastrians from Persia. The market didn't care what you believed, so long as your goods were good and your deals fair. In a strange way, the marketplace was more tolerant than most other institutions. Coins didn't discriminate. And yet, beneath this dazzling machine, there were risks. Floods could ruin shipments. Bandits sometimes intercepted caravans. Famine in one region could spike grain prices in another. And yes, corruption existed. Some mutasibs were bribed. Some weights were rigged. Some coins debased. People complained. Some turned to religion for justice. Others to street poets who would roast corrupt merchants with rhyming sarcasm. Everyone had their outlet. Then there were the guilds, not official in the modern sense, but loosely formed groups of craftsmen, coppersmiths, tanners, butchers, weavers. They regulated training, quality, and sometimes prices. You couldn't just set up shop and claim to be a cobbler. You needed a master to vouch for you. You needed to prove your hands knew what they were doing. Apprentices learned slow. They swept floors, fetched tools, stirred dyes. Years might pass before they were allowed to cut leather or twist gold wire. But once accepted, you were family. If your stall burned, The guild helped. If you died, they saw to your burial. Markets weren't just commercial, they were communal. Which brings us to a quiet but crucial detail: trust. Without trust, none of it worked. Not the written credit, not the haggling, not the thousands of tiny invisible transactions happening every hour. If a merchant's scale was off, he'd lose his regulars. If a buyer delayed payment too often, word would spread. The market had no official PR system, but rumors moved faster than silk caravans. Still, most people played fair, because they had to, and because deep down they wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves. You couldn't walk through the Baghdad market without feeling it, that sense that this wasn't just trade, it was tradition, a legacy passed hand to hand, from father to son, mother to daughter, neighbor to stranger. A whispered agreement that as long as people needed food, books, spices, or stories, the souk would stay alive. Even now, centuries later, in the dust of history, you can still hear the echo, the coins clinking, the sellers calling, the city breathing. Let's linger for a moment. After the last bread stall has dimmed its lantern, after the din of daytime bargaining has faded to a hush, and just when you'd think the market has slipped off to sleep. But Baghdad doesn't sleep. Not really. Not all of it. Because when the sun bows out and the lamps begin to glow, another version of the market awakens. It's slower, yes, softer, but in some ways even more alive. Night in the Abbasid souk wasn't just a quiet afterthought. It had its own personality, one shaped by celebration, rhythm, and that sweet in-between space where business mingled with leisure. Especially during the holy months or festival times, the marketplaces lit up like poems. Lanterns swayed gently on ropes stretched from shop to shop, some fashioned from colored glass, others from beaten copper with tiny punched-out stars that spilled light like secrets. Vendors didn't disappear after dusk. Some just changed their wares. The spice sellers closed shop, but in their place, out came the sweet makers. Men with nimble hands worked sugar into pistachio-filled rolls, sesame brittle, honey-soaked dough twisted into golden spirals. You'd see children press their noses against glass jars filled with candied citrus peels or spiced almonds. And always there was halva, stacked in blocks, sliced like cheese, served on scraps of parchment. And the drinks? You didn't just find water. No, nighttime meant flavored syrups, saffron water, rose water sherbet, cooled tamarind juice served in small clay cups. Sellers walked the streets with tall flasks slung across their shoulders, clinking brass cups to call thirsty passers-by. A few sold something more curious, a milky mixture said to calm nerves and settle the stomach. Whether it worked or not, people bought it. Maybe it was the warmth in the way it was offered. This was the time of night musicians. Near the book souk, where the parchment had been packed away and scribes went home, oud players tuned their strings. A soft, plucking melody floated down alleyways, sometimes joined by a low drum beat or the gentle tap of finger cymbals. Not concerts, really, just music for the sake of it, for lingering, for letting the day slip out of your shoulders. And always there were poets. Some recited alone, standing near a step or a low wall, eyes half closed as they let the words fall like rain. Others performed for clusters of listeners, traders, scholars, beggars, guards, anyone who felt the tug of verse. Topics ranged from love to loss, from justice to gin. A few told stories that veiled politics under metaphor, clever enough to escape offence, sharp enough to leave a mark. It wasn't all men either. Women, too, walked these night markets, some veiled in fine black cloth, others draped in silks, their eyes lined with kohl. Some came with children, others met sisters or neighbours. They browsed jewellery stalls, fingered the tassels on embroidered cloaks, or just walked. There was something about the night that felt more equal, less rushed, safer somehow, under the soft cloak of shadows. Of course, there were guards. Market constables patrolled the more crowded corners, carrying wooden staves or short swords, not to intimidate, but to watch, to keep mischief in check, to make sure the lanterns stayed lit and the SUQ didn't dissolve into chaos. It rarely did. Baghdad was noisy, not reckless. And then came the festive nights. During Eid, the market became something else entirely. Less commerce, more carnival. Musicians set up proper stages. There were acrobats, tightrope walkers, even trained animals. Sellers didn't just peddle. Many gave samples, tossed sweets to children, or roasted nuts in massive brass pans just for the smell of it. Some shopkeepers stayed open all night, not to sell really, but because they didn't want to miss it. Lanterns multiplied, their flickering gold making the stone streets look like molten copper. You'd see coloured fabric strung like banners overhead, young men in new robes, girls with fresh henna still staining their fingers. And in Ramadan, oh, Ramadan turned the market into a living prayer. All day, the souk stayed quiet, tense even, the air hot, mouths dry, food covered tightly. But when the Maghrib call to prayer rang out, when that first date touched the tongue, Baghdad transformed. Drums rolled, food poured out in rivers, bowls of stewed lamb, platters of rice, cups of yogurt, baskets of warm bread. Families sat in rows. Strangers were welcomed without question. Shopkeepers lit candles in glass bowls, letting the wax drip down like blessings. The night didn't end. It softened. People walked slowly. They listened more. They told stories, not the quick ones made for daylight gossip, but the old kind, the stories that had roots, the ones their grandparents told, stories of blacksmiths and caravans, of stolen rings and wise caliphs, of lost cities and stars that whispered to the earth. Even the market itself felt older then, as if it remembered something. You could walk those streets at midnight and still hear the hum, still feel the warmth rising from the stones, still see two men arguing playfully over a pot of pickled lemons, still spot a young girl clapping to the rhythm of a tabla, played by a blind man with perfect pitch. Some said Baghdad's market never slept. Maybe that was true, maybe not. But one thing was certain. It dreamed. Every night, under those flickering lanterns, it dreamed of another morning. Let's shift now, not away from the market, but beneath its surface, past the sweet smells and silver dinars, past the crowd and noise. There was something quieter holding it all together. Rules, order, a shared sense of what was right and what wasn't. The Abbasid marketplace, for all its chaos and laughter, didn't run wild. It had a conscience, and at the heart of that conscience stood a figure known as the Muhtasib. Now, the Muhtasib wasn't exactly a judge, nor was he a merchant. He was something in between, a moral supervisor of the marketplace, a sort of civic referee. You could say he was part inspector, part enforcer, part teacher, and occasionally part therapist. His job wasn't to punish, at least not at first. It was to remind, to maintain fairness, to protect both the buyer and the seller. And honestly, that was no small task. Picture this. A man stands in the middle of the cloth alley, weighing bolts of silk on a scale that looks just a little off. Maybe one side hangs lower, or the weight is chipped at the edge. The muhtasib walks by, not in a rush, but with eyes like lanterns. He pauses, doesn't yell, doesn't accuse, just watches. And the merchant? He knows. He might cough awkwardly, adjust the scale, offer a quick excuse. The boy dropped the weight this morning, or it must be the heat. The muhtasib nods. He's heard it all. If the offence is minor, he might just issue a warning, a raised brow, a soft word. But if it's serious, fines, public correction, in extreme cases, closure of the stall. But here's the thing. His role wasn't just about weights and measures. The muhtasib watched everything. He watched the fish vendor to ensure his stock wasn't spoiled. He checked that meat sellers washed their boards and kept flies off their cuts. He stopped by the bread stalls to make sure prices weren't inflated during shortages. He even watched the street performers to ensure their lyrics weren't blasphemous or offensive. His presence wasn't feared exactly, more like respected or occasionally resented. But even then, merchants recognized his value, because without the muhtasib, the market could become something darker. Corruption could creep in. And once trust left the SUQ, so would the people. But he wasn't alone. The muhtasib worked within a broader moral framework shaped by Islamic ethics, local customs, and the caliph's own decrees. Scholars and jurists issued opinions, fatwas, on proper behavior in trade. These weren't laws in the modern sense, but they carried weight. People quoted them. Merchants framed them. Debates over their meaning spilled into tea shops and bookstalls. One common principle: honesty in weights and measures. It came directly from the Quran, which speaks harshly of those who cheat in balance. Another: avoid unnecessary swearing oaths during trade. Sellers who constantly swore by God to prove their honesty were viewed with suspicion. If your word needed divine backup every 5 minutes, maybe your goods weren't that trustworthy. And then there was gharar, a concept meaning excessive uncertainty or deception in trade. Selling something without describing it clearly, that was a problem. Hiding flaws, worse. Islam encouraged trade. It wasn't anti-market, but it demanded transparency. Deals needed to be clean, mutual, respectful. Even how you displayed your goods mattered. You couldn't pile good dates on top and hide the rotten ones underneath. You couldn't water down milk or mix wheat with pebbles to increase weight. These things weren't just immoral, they were revolting. If caught, you'd be ridiculed, not just by the muhtasib, but by your neighbors. Word spread quickly in the souk, and reputation was everything. And then came the moral atmosphere. The market wasn't just about what you sold, but how you acted. Lewd speech, not welcome. Flirtatious behavior, frowned upon, especially in daylight hours. That's not to say the market was stiff or joyless. It wasn't. People laughed, teased, even flirted, quietly, carefully. But overtly scandalous behavior, number not in public, not under the eyes of the muhtasib or of God. You'd often see signs near mosque courtyards or on market gates, verses or sayings reminding people to be fair, to be grateful, to fear God. Some were painted, others carved, a few scribbled in chalk. Even illiterate passers-by could sense their weight. They were part of the space, a moral architecture built into the walls. Friday was especially important. Just before the midday prayer, things would shift. Sellers wrapped their goods. Shoppers paused. You could hear the city take a breath. Some men hurried to the mosque. Others prayed where they stood. A few shops stayed open, usually watched over by younger boys or non-Muslim assistants, but most paused. The muhtasib walked then too, not inspecting, but reminding. His presence said, even commerce needs silence sometimes. And yes, the market had its limits. There were lines you couldn't cross, items you couldn't sell, behavior you couldn't exhibit. Some of these were religious boundaries, others were cultural. You couldn't sell wine, obviously, not openly at least. You couldn't peddle charms claiming to change fate or bring rain, unless, of course, you phrased it cleverly. Baghdad had a way of making even its rules poetic. But what's striking is how embedded these ethics were, not as burdens, but as rhythm. They weren't rules you stumbled over. They were grooves in the road. Most people followed them, not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in the system. They believed that a just marketplace brought down blessings, that honest trade pleased God, that every coin earned cleanly was worth more than 10 earned in trickery. And you know what? That's what made the SUQ more than a place of exchange. It made it sacred, not with incense and robes, but with flour and figs and sellers who gave honest change. It was sacred in how it treated the widow buying 2 eggs, or the orphan selling candles by the gate. It was sacred in its order, its respect, its balance. And somehow, amid the shouting and the smoke, the haggling and the hammering, you could feel it. Even if you didn't have the words, even if you just came to buy a little cumin. Eventually, even the loudest markets grow quiet. Not all at once, not like a slammed door. Decline doesn't usually come with an announcement. It comes subtly, like a shop that closes a little earlier each evening, or a path that sees fewer footprints with every season. The markets of Abbasid Baghdad were no different. They didn't vanish overnight. They faded, slowly, sadly. But let's rewind a bit. At their height, these souks were unmatched. Financial engines, cultural crossroads, places where books were sold beside baklava, and poets debated alongside fishmongers. But Baghdad, like all cities that shine too brightly, attracted attention. And not all of it was kind. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, cracks had begun to show. Political stability wavered. Power shifted from caliphs to regional warlords. The Abbasids, once commanding and unified, now held only spiritual authority, while real control slipped to the hands of military leaders and dynasties like the Buyids and Seljuks. And as the palace fractured, so too did the market. Trade needs security. Caravans don't travel through lands riddled with conflict. Merchants won't risk bandits on the road if the empire's borders no longer protect them. Gradually, the long-distance traffic, the camels bearing silk from China, the spice-laden ships from India, the scrolls and glassware from Alexandria, slowed, not vanished, just thinned. You could still find plenty in Baghdad. The bakers didn't stop baking. The cobblers still stitched sandals. The booksellers still argued over grammar. But the spirit had shifted. That effortless, buoyant energy, the sense that Baghdad was the center of the world. It had begun to dim. And then, in 1258, the hammer fell. The Mongols arrived. Led by Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, they came not as merchants, but as conquerors. Baghdad, once the intellectual capital of the Islamic world, was sacked in a brutal campaign. The libraries were burned. The canals, centuries-old arteries that irrigated gardens and cooled courtyards, were clogged with bodies. Markets were looted. Vendors slain. The city's rhythm, so carefully tuned over generations, was shattered. It's hard to grasp, even now, the scale of what was lost. One chronicler wrote that the Tigris ran black with ink from the books of the House of Wisdom. Another claimed the river turned red with blood. Maybe that's poetic exaggeration. Maybe not. But the truth sits somewhere in the silence that followed. The Souks didn't just lose goods. They lost memory, structure, identity. And yet, something lingered. Because the soul of a market doesn't rest in stone walls or carved stalls. It rests in habits, customs, quiet understandings passed from one shopkeeper to another. Even in the centuries that followed, when Baghdad was rebuilt, reoccupied, repopulated, traders still gathered. They still haggled. They still weighed cumin seeds and poured tea and told jokes between sales. The names of some alleys changed, some guilds vanished, but the heartbeat pulsed, faint and defiant. Today, in the markets of modern Baghdad, if you listen carefully, you can still hear it. A woman in her 60s selling herbs might wrap your mint in newspaper, just like her grandmother once did, except now it's in a plastic bag. A boy might shout out the day's bread price using the same chant heard 1,000 years ago. A butcher might pause to let the call to prayer roll over the rooftops before returning to his scales. It's not the same, of course. Nothing ever is. The pace is faster. The goods, mass-produced. The chaos a little louder. Perhaps less poetic. But there's still a thread that stretches back. Invisible, but strong. And across the Arab world, from Fez to Cairo to Aleppo to Sana'a, echoes of Abbasid markets still hum through the souks. The layout, the rhythm, the scent of spices under linen awnings, the expectation that you'll argue for a fair price, not pay the first one offered. The way stalls are grouped, textiles with textiles, gold with gold, books near mosques. Even the idea of the muhtasib lives on, maybe not under that name, maybe not in every market, but inspectors still visit shops, weighing scales are still checked. Public behavior, in some countries, is still quietly or loudly monitored. And so, though the Abbasid Caliphate fell, and though Baghdad has been through sieges, occupations, and heartbreak that no city should have to endure, its markets have left fingerprints on the world, not in marble, but in memory, not in gold, but in gestures, in the way a vendor calls out, not with a digital ad, but with the same lilting voice his ancestors used centuries ago, in the way strangers still pause in the middle of a busy market to argue about poetry, in the smell of cardamom rising from a coffee stand just as the sky turns pale. In that, the Abbasid market lives on. So if you ever walk through an old souk, whether in Baghdad or somewhere far-flung, and the air shifts just right, you might feel it, that whisper, that warmth, that faint rhythm under the chatter. You're not imagining it. You're just walking through time. Let's not end just yet, because a market, any market, is more than what it sells, and more than the history books say. It's about the people, The faces you remember long after you've forgotten what you bought. And in Abbasid Baghdad, those people formed a caste as rich and varied as any novel. Sellers, buyers, hustlers, dreamers, some honest, some clever, some dishonest, but charming enough to get away with it, most of the time. There was the bread seller. He knew every child's name in his alley. He'd sometimes slip a fresh piece to a barefoot boy, saying, "Pay tomorrow," knowing the boy had no coin and no tomorrow either, but he'd smile anyway. There was the calligrapher who barely sold anything, but came every day, hoping just one customer might understand the beauty and the loops of his ink. And the widow who sold lentils, always at the same spot, who never spoke, but whose prices were always just a little lower than anyone else's. Some were legends in their own time, like the butcher who refused to raise prices even when meat became scarce. When asked why, he'd say, "I have enough to eat. What more does God want from me?" Or the barber who set up his stall in the corner of the SUQ, not just to cut hair, but to listen. People told him everything: affairs, debts, dreams. He was half therapist, half priest, all wrapped in the smell of rosewater and soap. And there were characters who weren't shopkeepers at all. The man who recited Quranic verses while selling wax candles, not loudly, not for show, just rhythmically, like breathing. The wandering poet who never stayed in one place, but walked the souk, offering to write a line of verse for a date or a plum. Some said he had once been rich. Others said he'd never had a roof. No one knew, but everyone liked him. There were the apprentices, boys mostly, some girls too, learning the ways of trade. They swept floors, carried bundles, ran errands, got scolded and praised in equal measure. They watched how their masters spoke to customers, how they smiled at the right moments, how they weighed exactly a quarter kilo of raisins without needing to look. They learned not just how to sell, but how to be. And in the background, always, were the women, not just as buyers or quiet figures wrapped in dark veils. Some sold perfume, others cloth. Some stitched buttons into tunics while nursing babies. Their voices weren't loud, but they carried. And when they bargained, shopkeepers knew to tread lightly. "Mothers don't forget unfair prices," they'd say, half joking, half terrified. Children darted between legs, getting in trouble and out of it again in the same breath. Old men watched the crowd like retired generals. Blind men sat with bowls, reciting lines from long-forgotten songs. Stray cats lounged on roof ledges, pretending they weren't waiting for the fish vendor to drop a scrap. And then there were the foreigners, traders from India with thick accents and bright tunics, fat-faced merchants from the north, their beards braided in curious styles, quiet Jews from Yemen with ledgers neater than calligraphy, Greek doctors, Armenian goldsmiths, Persian scholars. The market was a stage, and Baghdad invited the world to perform. What made it all work wasn't magic. It was memory. Everyone remembered who you were, what you sold, how you treated others. If you cheated once, they'd forgive you. Maybe. Twice. And your name would stick like a stain on glass. But if you were kind, fair, generous in little ways, that would travel too. Maybe farther. Maybe forever. Some say you can judge a civilization by how it treats its dead. Others say, look at its markets. What did people sell? How did they sell it? Who was allowed to speak? Who was protected? Who was silenced? The Abbasid souk answered all those questions, not with laws carved in stone, but with customs carried in voice, in handshakes, in habits repeated 1,000 times across centuries. The market was never just a place to buy lentils or silk or sandalwood. It was where a young boy saw what adulthood looked like, where a traveller learned the local tongue through trade, where a poor man could earn a coin with a smile and a skill, where faith and food, poetry and pricing, all collided into something alive. And that's why it lingers, not just in Baghdad, but in Cairo's Khan el-Khalili, in the spice aisles of Aleppo, in the narrow cloth lanes of Marrakesh, in the tea sellers' calls in Fez, in the scent of roasting almonds near the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. The Abbasid market, in some way, never ended. It scattered. It seeded itself across the Islamic world. It left behind not ruins, but routines. So when you walk through a market today, if you slow down just a little, if you watch the way a seller arranges his apples, or how a woman runs her fingers across folded cotton, or how a boy negotiates for something he probably can't afford, you'll feel it. The echo, not loud, not urgent, but warm, like an old friend smiling from a memory you didn't know you had. And you'll realize something simple, something eternal. A market is never really about what you take home. It's about what you carry forward. If you've made it this far, thank you. You've walked the alleys of a city that's more memory than map now. You've seen the worn stalls under shifting light. You've heard the clang of hammers on brass, the shout of the fig seller, the rustle of silk as a buyer made her choice. You've smelled rosewater, cumin, dust, ink, and ambition. But perhaps most importantly, you've witnessed what it means when a city breathes through its commerce, when the market isn't just a backdrop to daily life, but its very rhythm. Baghdad, during the Abbasid Golden Age, wasn't perfect. No place ever is. But what made it remarkable wasn't just its scholars or caliphs. It was that a city of 1,000,000 could move together, day after day, trading not just goods but trust, not just spices, but stories. And here's the part that still gives pause. This wasn't done with algorithms or credit cards or e-commerce platforms. This was human, raw, repeated, passed down. It was done with hands and voices, smiles and frowns, mistakes and kindness. It was done with a scale, a bit of chalk, a few copper coins, and a deep belief that the marketplace could be a place of dignity. We don't always remember history through its markets. We often remember its wars, its rulers, its palaces. But if you listen closely, it's the souks that tell the full story, the real story, the street-level story. Because while caliphs built mosques and walls, it was the people who kept the city alive. Every time they opened a stall, every time they gave honest change, every time they offered a cup of tea to a tired traveller without asking for payment. That was the empire, and maybe that still is. Let's walk just a few steps further, one last time, because even though the stalls are closing in this story, the dust still clings to your sandals. There's a shadow of something lingering, the kind of presence that follows you, gently, into your next breath, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder, half expecting to still hear the rustle of linen canopies or the sing-song call of a boy selling rosewater by the cup. And maybe, in a strange way, that's the quiet genius of it all. The Abbasid markets weren't built to last in marble. They were built to linger in the human imagination, not through monuments, but mannerisms, not through walls, but through wisdom passed from one palm to another. Some lessons are never written down. They're lived, learned over hundreds of conversations, hundreds of small trades that no historian will ever record. But you can feel them. Like the tailor who stitched extra care into the hem of a cloak, not because it was requested, but because he believed every thread carried the weight of his name. Or the spice vendor who taught his son how to grind cinnamon just so, never too coarse, never too fine, while telling stories of cities he'd never visited, but swore smelled like pepper and jasmine. Or the old woman selling vinegar and herbs, who'd been in the same spot for decades, her presence as constant as the fountain's trickle behind her, as steady as the arc of the sun overhead. What is all this, if not civilization? You see, the Abbasid souk wasn't just commerce, it was community, it was culture in motion, a place where trade and trust intersected, where faith shaped behavior, and where beauty wasn't reserved for palaces. It lived in every marketplace corner, in every copper bowl polished to a shine, in every cloth folded with care. We often think history moves with wars and declarations, but more often than not, it moves quietly, through how someone greets you, through the tone of a seller's voice, through the way two strangers agree on a price, shake hands, and part as neighbors, though they may never see each other again. So when you remember the golden age of Baghdad, don't just think of libraries and caliphs. Think of the market. Think of the seller wiping dust from a scale, the boy lighting a lantern at sunset, the woman carefully choosing 6 figs from a pile, not 5, not 7, the shopkeeper who knows his regulars by voice alone. And think, maybe, of yourself, walking there, blending in, just another heartbeat in a living city. You don't need a passport. You don't even need perfect memory. Just curiosity, just respect, just a moment to pause and listen. Because that market, the real one, the one beneath the dates and dirhams and poetry, it's still open, right now, in the mind, and in the quiet rhythm of stories still being told, because no great journey should end in silence. It deserves a parting word, a kind of nod between old friends. And now that the marketplace has emptied, now that the lanterns have flickered out and the bread ovens have cooled, you can finally look around and realize what really happened here. You didn't just listen to a documentary. You visited a world built by hands and hearts, not perfect, not polished, but deeply human. A world where someone weighed saffron like it was sacred, where someone else stitched poetry into cloth, where men argued over Aristotle beside baskets of apricots. And somewhere in the middle of all that, life happened. Messy, beautiful, rhythmic life. That's the thing about Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate. It wasn't just a capital. It was a canvas, painted by 1,000 unseen brushes. Every merchant was a stroke, every alley a line. And the marketplace? That was the chorus. Loud, layered, honest. And the best part? None of it asked you to be anything but present. It didn't care what you knew or what you wore. It only asked that you look, that you smell the spices, feel the dust, hear the clatter of coin and the music of the crowd, that you linger by the fig stand, even if you weren't hungry, just to watch a deal being made, or to hear the seller tell that same joke he's been using for years, because it still works. And now, Well, now you know. You carry this place with you. It sits somewhere inside, tucked like a story you didn't mean to keep. But it's there, a little echo of Abbasid Baghdad, the kind of thing you remember randomly, in a modern market, while weighing tomatoes, or when someone offers you mint tea and you catch a whiff of cardamom in the steam, or when you bargain, just a little, and realize it's not about money, but connection. That's legacy. That's what endures when stone falls and empires fade. Not the gold, not the thrones, but the souk, because the marketplace is where the empire met its people every single day. And somehow, if you listen closely, it still does. Let's keep going. This time, not into the marketplace, but into the afterglow. You've traveled, you've listened, you've breathed in 1,000 smells and walked beneath hanging lamps. But if there's one last thing worth saying, it's this. The real gift of the Abbasid souk wasn't just what it sold. It was what it taught. It taught patience, in the long rhythm of negotiation, in the hours it took to roast spices just right, in the years it took to learn a trade from scratch. It taught humility, because no matter how grand your goods were, someone always sold them better, or cheaper, or with more grace. And even the caliph himself, if he passed through the market gates, would walk on the same stones as the beggar and the butcher. No gilded throne, just the souk. It taught trust, not blind trust, but the kind built slowly, day after day, between buyers and sellers, between traders and scribes, between city and citizen. And when trust was broken, the market remembered. The market always remembered. It taught listening, because the market was a place of stories. You had to listen to know who was honest, who was hurting, who needed the price brought down a little, even if they didn't ask. It taught beauty, not just the lavish kind, in gold or silk, but the quiet kind, the symmetry of stacked pomegranates, the worn elegance of a scale that had weighed generations of olives, the poetry stitched into a prayer rug, the warmth of a vendor calling a regular customer by name. And it taught continuity, that things don't have to stay the same to survive. They just need people willing to carry them forward, willing to remember. So now, as we close the final shutters on this story, the question isn't what Baghdad's market was. It's what it still is, somewhere, in the crackle of roasted nuts on a winter street corner, in the smell of cloves rising from your mother's kitchen, in the sound of someone haggling, not out of greed, but out of ritual, a handshake of old. In the moment, someone gives you more than you paid for and just says, "It's nothing, go in peace." The Abbasid marketplace lives there, still trading, still teaching, still waiting for anyone curious enough to stop, listen, and ask, how much for a story? Let's give this story the kind of goodbye it deserves, not with a fade out, but with a lasting impression. Because when a tale carries this much soul, when it holds within it the rhythm of a civilization, it deserves not just to end, but to stay. So let's place it somewhere it can live on. Imagine a narrator, voice gentle as lamp smoke, whispering this final line as the screen fades to black. Not all ruins are built of stone. Some survive in the smell of cardamom and in the way strangers greet each other in a crowded street. That's the aftertaste of the Abbasid market. Not drama, not spectacle, but memory with weight. the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. Because if you listen again tomorrow, or a month from now, it'll still feel warm, familiar, alive. And when you walk through your own marketplace, wherever you are, Riyadh, Cairo, London, Chicago, look for it. Not with your eyes, but with your instincts, in the rhythm of the crowd, in the generosity of a seller, in the way someone says, welcome, and means it. Baghdad's old market is still open, just scattered across time. And you now are one of its keepers. Let's keep the ember glowing just a little longer, because some stories aren't meant to close cleanly. They don't ask for a door to be shut behind them. They want to sit with you, quietly, like an old merchant at sunset, legs crossed, eyes watching the crowd, not to sell any more, but just to witness. And in that silence, there's one last truth to offer. Baghdad's marketplace wasn't just a part of the city, it was the city, not by size or wealth or fame, but by feel. It was the pulse, the shared space, the meeting ground where philosopher and fishmonger brushed sleeves and didn't feel the difference, where a baker and a mathematician argued over lentil prices with the same intensity they'd argue about the movement of stars, where religion and reason weren't separate corners of life, they were ingredients in the same stew. What the marketplace taught, day after day for centuries, was that you could build something better together, just by being decent, by being present, by showing up and doing your part, whether that was grinding sesame or binding books, or wiping down a wooden counter at dusk. It didn't promise riches. It didn't offer fairness to everyone, every day, but it offered a space, a structure, a rhythm, and you could find your place in it. That's rare, even now. So here's the truth of it. Long after the caliphs died, long after the invaders came and the gold wore thin, the idea of the souk, the feel of it, outlived them all. And if this story finds you in a crowded city, or a quiet town, or somewhere in between, know this. You don't need incense smoke and oud music to find it again. All you need is a place where people still trade, still talk, still offer things with hands instead of algorithms, where someone wraps your fruit with care, where someone gives you one extra date just because. That's the souk. That's Baghdad, still here, still waiting, and now you carry it with you. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that you could step back into that world, that the gates of Abbasid Baghdad opened once more, not as ruins in a textbook, but as living doors in front of you, that your feet touch the dusty stone of the souk just before dawn, when the sky was still that perfect shade between ink and pearl. What would you see? Maybe a baker brushing flour from his arms, sliding dough into the mouth of a clay oven while humming a tune no one ever wrote down. Maybe a boy crouched beside a basket of oranges, arranging them not by size, but by beauty, because that's what his father taught him. Maybe the bookseller already arguing with his rival 2 stalls over about who has the better translation of Galen. And maybe someone spots you, new, curious, uncertain, and calls out, not to sell you anything, just to say, come, you're just in time, because the market, above all, was a place that made room for noise and quiet, for talk and thought, for buyers and wanderers, and for stories like yours. You weren't expected to be anyone special. You just had to be there. That was enough. And that's what you've done. By listening, by walking these imagined streets, You've been there. You've stepped through the canvas. The market of Abbasid Baghdad was made of clay and cloth, but also of rhythm and routine, and the stubborn kindness of ordinary people. That's why it still matters, why it will always matter, because even when the walls have crumbled, the way someone gives you exact change with a smile, that's the souk. The way a stallholder offers you a date and says, "Try it before you buy it," that's the souk. The way a father teaches his son to count aloud while measuring almonds, that too is the souk. And now it's in you. You carry it forward, maybe in how you listen to others, maybe in how you notice the way a woman ties her scarf before opening her stall, maybe in the way you pause to appreciate the texture of a handmade bowl, even if you don't buy it. You carry it not in gold or goods, but in awareness, in reverence for the ordinary. And that's all the souk ever asked for.